The sun peeked over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp, carrying a slight chill that hinted at the arrival of autumn. People bustled around the palace grounds, their voices blending with the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. Cameras clicked incessantly as tourists gathered eagerly to catch a glimpse of the iconic royal guards standing tall and motionless near the grand entrance of the palace. Their crimson tunics and towering bearskin hats made them look like statues carved out of history itself. Among the crowd stood an elderly man named Harold Thompson. His presence wasn't immediately noticeable. He didn't carry himself with flashy confidence or loud enthusiasm like some of the other visitors. Instead, he moved slowly, leaning slightly on his cane as he navigated through the throng of people. His weathered face told stories of a life filled with both triumphs and hardships. Deep lines etched across his forehead spoke of years spent under the scorching sun and biting cold, while his hands, calloused and worn, hinted at countless days of hard work. Despite his frail appearance, there was something undeniably dignified about him. Harold had traveled far to be here today. He lived in a quiet village miles away from the city, where life moved at a slower pace. For decades, he had avoided crowded places, finding solace in the simplicity of his daily routines. But this trip was different. It wasn't just another outing. It was a pilgrimage of sorts. Harold had served his country during one of its darkest times, fighting battles that most people only read about in history books. Today, he wanted to pay tribute, not just to the monarchy, but also to the ideals of service and sacrifice they represented. As Harold drew closer to the palace gates, his gaze fixed on one of the guards standing perfectly still, his expression unreadable behind the stoic mask of duty. Something stirred inside Harold, a mix of nostalgia, pride, and sorrow. Memories began flooding back, uninvited yet vivid. He remembered the faces of his comrades, men who had once laughed and joked beside him, but were now long gone. He thought about the letters he'd written home, the nights spent staring at the stars, wondering if he'd ever see his family again. Each memory weighed heavily on his heart, yet they also filled him with a sense of purpose. The chatter of the crowd faded into the background as Harold focused on the guard. He noticed how the young man's posture exuded discipline, every muscle taut and ready. It reminded Harold of his own days in uniform, when standing tall was more than just a physical act. It was a declaration of commitment. As he adjusted the medals pinned to his coat, a silent reminder of wars fought and lives lost, Harold felt a surge of emotion bubbling up within him. This wasn't just a tourist attraction for him. It was a sacred moment, a chance to honor those who couldn't stand here today. With slow, deliberate steps, Harold approached the guard. His cane tapped softly against the pavement, a rhythmic sound that seemed to echo his thoughts. The crowd around him continued snapping pictures and chatting excitedly, oblivious to the storm of emotions brewing inside the elderly man. Harold took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to do what felt right. Little did he know, this simple act would soon leave everyone around him speechless. Harold's mind was a whirlwind of memories as he stood just a few feet away from the royal guard. The polished buttons on the young man's uniform gleamed in the morning sunlight, and his stiff posture reminded Harold of the drills he had endured during his own training years ago. But it wasn't just the guard's appearance that caught Harold's attention. It was the weight of what he represented. To Harold, this wasn't just another ceremonial figure standing silently for tourists to admire. It was a symbol of duty, sacrifice, and the unbroken chain of service that stretched across generations. As Harold gazed at the guard, images from his past began flashing before his eyes. He remembered the muddy trenches where he had spent countless sleepless nights, listening to the distant rumble of artillery fire. He recalled the faces of his comrades, men who had become like brothers to him in those harrowing months. Some of them had been full of jokes, lightening the mood even in the darkest moments. Others were quiet and reserved, their courage shining not through words but through actions. Harold could still hear their laughter echoing in his ears, though it had been decades since he last saw them. But then came the harder memories, the ones that haunted him even now. He thought about the day he lost his best friend, Tom, during an ambush. They had been crouching behind a crumbling wall, sharing a meager ration of bread when everything changed in an instant. One moment, Tom was alive, cracking the weak joke about how terrible the food was. The next, there was only silence. Harold had tried to shake him awake, calling out his name over and over, but it was too late. That loss had left a void inside him, one that no amount of time could ever fully fill. These memories weren't just abstract thoughts. They were vivid and raw, as if they had happened yesterday. Harold felt the familiar ache in his chest, the same one that surfaced whenever he allowed himself to dwell on the past. Yet today, something was different. Standing here, surrounded by strangers, and watching the young guard stand so proudly, Harold felt a strange sense of connection. It was as though the guard was a bridge between his generation and the present day. A reminder that while times may change, the values of honor and sacrifice remained constant. His fingers instinctively reached for the medals pinned to his coat. Each one told a story. The bravery of soldiers charging into battle despite overwhelming odds, the camaraderie forged in the face of danger, the pain of losing friends who would never return home. These small pieces of metal carried the weight of countless sacrifices, and Harold wore them not out of pride but out of respect for those who couldn't be here to wear their own. For a brief moment, Harold hesitated. Was it right to approach the guard? Would anyone understand why this mattered so much to him? But then he realized it didn't matter what others thought. This wasn't about seeking recognition or approval. It was about paying tribute to the men and women who had given everything for their country. With trembling hands, Harold adjusted his stance, drawing strength from the memories of those who had stood beside him in battle. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand in a salute, the same gesture he had performed countless times during his military career. It was more than just a movement of his arm. It was a silent promise. A promise to remember. A promise to honor. A promise to never let the sacrifices of his comrades fade into obscurity. As Harold held the salute, his eyes locked onto the guard's impassive face. For a fleeting second, he wondered if the young man noticed, if he understood the depth of emotion behind this simple act. Little did Harold know, his gesture was about to spark a reaction that would leave everyone around him deeply moved. Private James Whittaker had been standing at his post for nearly an hour, his body rigid and his expression carefully neutral. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the palace grounds, but James barely noticed. His focus was unwavering, trained to block out distractions like the chatter of tourists or the click of cameras. This was his duty, to stand tall and silent, a symbol of discipline and tradition. But as he scanned the crowd with practiced indifference, something caught his eye. It was Harold. The elderly man stood out, not because of any grand gesture or striking appearance, but because of the quiet dignity he carried. There was a heaviness in Harold's movements, a sense that every step required effort. Yet when he raised his hand in a crisp salute, James felt something stir within him, something unexpected. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the way Harold held the salute, his arm steady despite his age, his eyes locked onto James with an intensity that demanded attention. James had seen countless people walk by his post over the years, some curious, some indifferent, some even mocking. He had learned to maintain his composure no matter what. But this was different. Harold's salute didn't feel like a casual tourist trying to mimic military etiquette. It felt personal, deliberate, and deeply meaningful. For a moment, James forgot about protocol. He forgot about the weight of his bearskin hat, or the stiffness in his legs from standing still for so long. All he could think about was the story behind that salute. James knew little about Harold's past, but he didn't need to. The medals pinned to Harold's coat told part of the story, glinting softly in the sunlight. They spoke of battles fought, sacrifices made, and lives forever changed. And then there was Harold's face, a map of experiences etched into every wrinkle and crease. His eyes carried a sadness that no words could fully capture, yet they also radiated strength and resilience. To James, it was clear that this man had endured hardships most people couldn't imagine. In that split second, James made a decision. Breaking protocol was risky. He knew that better than anyone. Guards were expected to remain immovable, their role defined by discipline and order. Stepping out of line could lead to consequences, both professional and personal. But as James looked at Harold, he realized that some moments transcended rules. This wasn't just another day on duty. This was a chance to show respect, not just to Harold, but to everyone who had served before him. Without hesitation, James moved forward, stepping away from his designated spot. The movement was subtle but significant. Tourists nearby paused mid-sentence, their conversations trailing off as they noticed the guard shifting. At first, no one understood what was happening. Was this part of the routine? Had something gone wrong? Questions buzzed in the air, but James ignored them. His focus was entirely on Harold. As James stepped closer, he felt a surge of emotion bubbling up inside him. He thought about his own journey, the grueling training sessions, the early mornings spent perfecting his posture, the pride he felt wearing the uniform. He thought about the history of the institution he represented and the countless individuals who had worn the same uniform before him. And now, standing face to face with Harold, he felt a profound connection to the legacy of service they both shared, albeit in different ways. James didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any phrase ever could. With slow, deliberate steps, he prepared to respond to Harold's salute, not just as a guard, but as a human being recognizing another's sacrifice. What happened next would leave everyone around them speechless, turning an ordinary morning into an unforgettable moment of unity and respect. As James stepped forward, the world around him seemed to slow down. The murmurs of the crowd faded into a distant hum, and the clicking of cameras became little more than a soft rhythm in the background. All that mattered now was the elderly man standing before him, Harold, whose salute had spoken volumes without a single word being uttered. James could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was powerful, like standing at the edge of something profound and transformative. James raised his arm in a perfect salute, mirroring Harold's gesture with precision and respect. But he didn't stop there. Something inside him, a mix of admiration, gratitude, and humility, urged him to go further. Slowly, deliberately, James lowered himself onto one knee. The movement was fluid yet deliberate, as if every inch of his descent carried meaning. His crimson tunic brushed against the ground, and the brim of his bearskin hat tilted slightly forward. But his focus never wavered. He kept his eyes fixed on Harold, ensuring that the older man understood the depth of his respect. The crowd gasped audibly, their collective surprise rippling through the air like a wave. Some people froze mid-step, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. Others instinctively reached for their phones, capturing the scene before them with trembling hands. No one spoke. Even the children, who moments ago had been laughing and pointing at the guards, fell silent. It was as though everyone present could sense the significance of what they were witnessing, an unspoken bond forming between two individuals from vastly different worlds. For Harold, the moment was overwhelming. His hand, still raised in salute, began to tremble ever so slightly. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring his vision, but he didn't lower his arm. He couldn't. This wasn't just about him. It was about all the men and women who had stood beside him in battle, many of whom had never come home. Seeing James kneel before him felt like an acknowledgement of their sacrifices, a validation of everything they had endured. It was a gesture that transcended words, cutting straight to the heart of what it meant to serve and be served. James remained kneeling, his posture unwavering despite the unusual position. To him, this act wasn't about breaking protocol or drawing attention to himself. It was about bridging a gap, a generational divide that often left veterans feeling forgotten or misunderstood. In kneeling, James wasn't diminishing the importance of his role as a royal guard. On the contrary, he was elevating it, showing that true service wasn't confined to following orders, but also included recognizing humanity in its purest form. The silence stretched on, heavy with emotion. Tourists exchanged glances, some wiping away tears while others simply stared in awe. A young woman clutching her camera whispered to her companion, "I've never seen anything like this." Her voice cracked with emotion, underscoring the impact of the moment. Even the other guards nearby, though trained to remain stoic, shifted subtly in their positions, their expressions betraying a flicker of admiration for James's boldness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James rose to his feet. His movements were measured, each step deliberate as he returned to his original stance. Though he resumed his formal posture, the connection he had forged with Harold lingered in the air, palpable and undeniable. For both men, the encounter had been more than just a fleeting interaction. It was a reminder of the shared values that united them across time and circumstance. As James stood once again in his designated spot, the crowd began to stir. People whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with wonder and reverence. Cameras continued to flash, capturing not just an extraordinary moment, but also the raw emotions etched onto every face. And while the palace grounds would soon return to their usual rhythm, no one who witnessed this exchange would forget it anytime soon. It was a testament to the power of simple acts of kindness, and how, sometimes, bending the rules can create moments that touch the soul. The silence that followed James's gesture was profound, almost sacred. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from boredom or disinterest, but rather the hushed stillness of reverence, a collective holding of breath as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. For a few fleeting moments, the palace grounds felt less like a tourist attraction and more like a place where history and humanity intertwined. The rustling leaves and distant chirping of birds seemed amplified in the absence of human noise, creating an atmosphere that was both intimate and monumental. Harold stood frozen, his salute still held high, though his arm trembled slightly under the weight of emotion. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks, catching the sunlight as they fell. His gaze remained locked with James's, unbroken even as the world around them buzzed with disbelief. To Harold, this moment was validation, proof that the sacrifices he and his comrades had made were not forgotten. It was as if James's kneeling had spoken directly to his soul, saying, "We see you. We honor you." For the crowd, the scene was nothing short of extraordinary. Strangers who had arrived at the palace as individuals now found themselves united by a shared sense of awe. A young mother clutching her toddler's hand pressed her lips together, visibly moved, while an older gentleman nearby adjusted his glasses, perhaps to hide the tears welling up in his eyes. Even the children, who moments ago had been giggling and pointing at the guards' tall hats, stood quietly, their wide-eyed expressions mirroring the gravity of the moment. Cameras flashed incessantly, capturing every angle of the interaction. Some tourists leaned over the velvet ropes, straining for a better view, while others simply stood rooted to the spot, unwilling to risk missing a single second of this unexpected display of respect. Social media apps were already lighting up with photos and videos, as people scrambled to document what they knew instinctively was something rare and special. One teenager muttered to his friend, "This is going viral for sure," but even he sounded subdued, caught up in the emotional weight of the moment. What made the scene so powerful was its simplicity. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, just two men connecting across generations through gestures steeped in meaning. James's act of kneeling broke the rigid formality of his role as a royal guard, transforming him into something more, a symbol of empathy and gratitude. And Harold, standing tall despite his frailty, embodied resilience and sacrifice. Together, they created a visual narrative that needed no explanation. Everyone present understood, on some level, the depth of what was being communicated. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the air began to shift. The initial shock gave way to a softer, warmer energy, a shared understanding that something beautiful had just unfolded. People started exchanging glances, nodding silently as if to say, "Did you see that too?" A man in a bright yellow jacket whispered to his wife, "That's the most incredible thing I have ever seen here." She nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Nearby, a group of schoolchildren erupted into spontaneous applause, their small hands clapping furiously. Others quickly joined in, until the sound of clapping filled the courtyard, echoing off the stone walls of the palace. James, now back in his formal stance, stood motionless once again, his face betraying none of the emotions swirling within him. But Harold finally lowered his arm, ending the salute. He exhaled deeply, as if releasing years of pent-up feelings. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time that morning, he smiled, a faint, bittersweet curve of his lips that conveyed both gratitude and sorrow. The medals on his chest gleamed softly in the sunlight, each one a testament to battles fought and lives lost. As Harold turned to walk away, the crowd parted respectfully, making space for him to pass. Some people reached out gently, touching his sleeve or offering murmured words of thanks. "Thank you for your service," said a woman with tears streaming down her face. Harold nodded in acknowledgement, too overwhelmed to respond verbally. Each step he took felt lighter, as though the weight he had carried for so long had begun to lift. Behind him, James resumed his post, his figure once again immovable and stoic. But the connection he had forged with Harold lingered, invisible yet undeniable. The ripple effects of his actions would spread far beyond the palace grounds, touching hearts and sparking conversations about duty, respect, and the enduring power of human connection. Though neither man said a word, their silent exchange had spoken volumes, leaving an indelible mark on everyone fortunate enough to witness it. As Harold walked away, his steps were slower than before, but there was a newfound lightness in his demeanor. The heaviness that had weighed on him for so long, the memories of battles fought, friends lost, and sacrifices made, seemed to have eased, if only slightly. His hand still rested on the medals pinned to his coat, as though ensuring they were secure, but his grip was gentler now. The crowd parted around him like water flowing around a rock, their eyes following his every movement with a mix of admiration and reverence. "You didn't have to do that," Harold finally managed to say, his voice low and trembling. Though he spoke softly, the words carried enough weight to reach James's ears. Harold stopped for a moment, turning halfway to look back at the young guard. His eyes glistened with unused tears, and his lips quivered as he struggled to find the right words. "Thank you," he added, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. It was a simple phrase, yet it encapsulated everything Harold felt: gratitude, relief, and a deep sense of being seen after years of feeling invisible. James didn't respond verbally, bound by protocol to remain silent. But his eyes said more than words ever could. They conveyed respect, understanding, and a quiet acknowledgement of the shared humanity between them. For Harold, that silent exchange was enough. He nodded once, a small gesture of mutual recognition, before continuing on his way. As he moved through the crowd, people stepped aside instinctively, creating a path for him, as if honoring not just the man, but also the legacy he represented. The ripple effects of the encounter began spreading almost immediately. Tourists who had been mere bystanders moments earlier now found themselves deeply affected by what they had witnessed. Conversations erupted throughout the palace grounds, each one tinged with awe and reflection. A middle-aged couple stood near the gates, discussing how rare it was to see such raw emotion in a place usually defined by formality and tradition. "That guard, he didn't have to kneel," the woman said, shaking her head in disbelief. "But he did, and it meant something." Others shared similar sentiments, their voices filled with admiration for both men. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, asking why the guard had knelt down. His father crouched beside him, explaining in simple terms about respect and gratitude. "Sometimes we do things not because we're told to, but because it's the right thing to do," he said, glancing toward James. The boy nodded solemnly, clearly moved by the explanation. Meanwhile, videos of the interaction began circulating online within minutes. Someone had captured the entire scene on their phone, a shaky but heartfelt recording that quickly gained traction across social media platforms. Comments poured in from all corners of the world, praising James for his compassion and Harold for his humility. "This is what true respect looks like," one commenter wrote. Another added, "Moments like these remind us of what really matters." Back at his post, James remained motionless, his expression as composed as ever. But inside, he felt a quiet pride, not for himself, but for having been part of something greater than protocol or duty. He thought about Harold's salute, the medals on his chest, and the stories they must represent. Those stories, though untold, resonated deeply with James. They reminded him of why he had chosen this path: to serve, to honor, and to connect. As the morning wore on, the palace grounds returned to their usual rhythm. New groups of tourists arrived, eager to snap photos of the guards. Yet whispers of what had happened lingered in the air, passed along from person to person like a cherished secret. Even those who hadn't witnessed the moment firsthand felt its impact, thanks to the viral footage and heartfelt accounts shared online. For Harold, the day took on a new meaning. As he wandered through the city afterward, he noticed strangers smiling at him warmly, some even nodding in respect. At first he assumed they recognized him from the palace, but then he realized it didn't matter. What mattered was the message behind the moment, that acts of kindness, no matter how small, could bridge divides and heal wounds. And for James, standing tall once again in his crimson tunic, the memory of Harold's salute stayed with him long after the crowd dispersed. It served as a reminder that while uniforms and traditions might define roles, it was empathy and humanity that truly connected people. Together, these two men, separated by age, experience, and circumstance, had created a moment that transcended time, leaving an indelible mark on everyone who bore witness. The encounter between Harold and James didn't end with their emotional exchange at the palace gates. In fact, it was only the beginning of something much larger, a ripple effect that spread far beyond the morning sunlit courtyard. Within hours, footage of the moment went viral, shared across social media platforms by tourists who had been lucky enough to witness it firsthand. The video captured every detail: Harold's trembling salute, James's respectful kneel, and the tearful expressions of onlookers. It wasn't just a story, it was a living testament to humanity's capacity for connection and gratitude. People from all walks of life were moved by what they saw. Comments flooded in from around the globe, each one adding another layer to the growing narrative. Veterans shared their own stories, recalling moments when they too had felt seen or honored after years of feeling overlooked. "This is why we served," wrote one former soldier beneath the video. "To know that our sacrifices matter, not just to history but to the people who come after us." Others expressed admiration for James, praising him for stepping outside protocol to show such profound respect. "That guard reminded us what true service looks like," one commenter noted. "It's not about rules, it's about heart." The story quickly caught the attention of local news outlets, which picked it up and ran features on both Harold and James. Reporters flocked to Harold's quiet countryside home, eager to learn more about the man behind the medals. At first, Harold was hesitant to speak. He had always preferred privacy over publicity. But eventually, he agreed to share his story. Sitting in his modest living room, surrounded by faded photographs and mementos from his time in the military, Harold spoke candidly about his experiences. He talked about the camaraderie he'd shared with his fellow soldiers, the pain of losing friends in battle, and the challenges of adjusting to civilian life after the war. His words were simple yet powerful, resonating deeply with viewers. James, meanwhile, found himself thrust into the spotlight as well. Though initially reluctant to discuss the incident, he eventually gave a brief interview, emphasizing that his actions had been motivated by genuine respect rather than a desire for recognition. "I saw a man who had given so much for his country," James explained. "All I wanted to do was acknowledge that. to let him know that his service hadn't been forgotten. His humility struck a chord with audiences, further amplifying the impact of the moment. Inspired by the outpouring of support, Harold began receiving invitations to speak at schools, community centers, and veterans events. For someone who had spent decades avoiding the limelight, this newfound attention was overwhelming, but also deeply rewarding. Harold discovered that sharing his story allowed him to keep the memories of his comrades alive, ensuring that their sacrifices would never fade into obscurity. Each speech he gave became an opportunity to educate younger generations about the realities of war and the importance of honoring those who serve. Meanwhile, James was formally recognized by his superiors, not for breaking protocol, but for exemplifying the values of empathy and unity that the Royal Guards were meant to uphold. While some traditionalists argued that his actions set a risky precedent, most agreed that James had done something extraordinary. His decision to kneel before Harold wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a reminder that even within rigid structures, there is room for compassion and humanity. As weeks turned into months, the bond between Harold and James continued to inspire others. Letters poured in from around the world, addressed to both men. Some were written by veterans thanking Harold for representing their struggles, while others came from ordinary citizens expressing gratitude to James for reminding them of the power of small gestures. One letter, sent by a young girl, included a drawing of a guard kneeling before a soldier with the caption, "Thank you for showing me what respect looks like." The story also sparked broader conversations about how society treats its veterans and honors their contributions. Community organizations launched initiatives to provide better support for aging veterans, while schools incorporated lessons about military service and sacrifice into their curriculums. What had started as a single moment between two individuals had ignited a movement, one rooted in gratitude, understanding, and a renewed commitment to remembering those who had given so much. Though Harold and James never met again after that day at the palace, their lives remained forever intertwined. They had become symbols of something greater than themselves, a reminder that even in silence, human connection has the power to heal wounds, bridge divides, and leave an indelible mark on the world. And as their story continued, the legacy of Harold and James's encounter stretched far beyond the palace grounds, weaving itself into the fabric of countless lives. What had begun as a quiet moment between two individuals grew into something timeless, a story that transcended generations, borders, and backgrounds. It became a beacon of hope, reminding people that even in a world often divided by differences, acts of kindness and respect could unite us in ways words alone never could. Harold embraced his newfound role as an ambassador for veterans' causes, traveling to schools, community events, and memorials to share his experiences. He spoke not just about the battles he'd fought, but also about the friendships he'd cherished and the lessons he'd learned along the way. His speeches were simple yet profound, filled with stories of bravery, loss, and resilience. Audiences listened intently, their eyes locked on the elderly man whose voice carried both wisdom and warmth. Children raised their hands eagerly during Q&A sessions, asking questions like, "Were you scared?" or "What did you miss most when you were away?" Harold answered each question thoughtfully, ensuring that every child left with a deeper understanding of sacrifice and service. For James, life returned to its usual rhythm at the palace, but he carried the memory of that morning with him every day. The experience had changed him, deepening his sense of purpose and reinforcing why he had chosen to become a royal guard. Though bound by tradition and protocol, he now understood that true duty wasn't confined to standing still. It was about recognizing humanity in all its forms. James often found himself reflecting on Harold's salute, using it as a source of inspiration whenever challenges arose in his work. Fellow guards began to notice a subtle shift in his demeanor. He seemed more approachable, more attuned to the emotions of those around him. Some even joked that James had set a new standard for compassion within their ranks. The bond between the two men continued to inspire others long after the initial buzz faded. Teachers used their story as a lesson in classrooms, encouraging students to think about how they could show gratitude in their own lives. One teacher created a project called Acts of Respect, where students wrote letters to veterans or performed small acts of kindness for people in their communities. If a single gesture can bring tears to someone's eyes, she told her class, imagine what we can achieve if we all make an effort. Communities rallied around the message of appreciation sparked by Harold and James's interaction. Veterans organizations reported an increase in volunteers wanting to help aging soldiers, while local businesses offered discounts and services to honor those who had served. Even strangers began approaching veterans in public, thanking them simply for their service. These gestures might have seemed small, but together they created a wave of positivity that touched countless lives. In time, Harold and James received invitations to attend a special ceremony hosted by the government to recognize their contributions to national unity and morale. Both men were hesitant at first, Harold because he didn't consider himself extraordinary, and James because he believed his actions were nothing out of the ordinary. But when they finally met again at the event, surrounded by applause and admiration, they exchanged a knowing glance. Neither needed to say a word. They both understood that this wasn't about them. It was about the values they represented. As the ceremony unfolded, a young girl stepped onto the stage to present them with tokens of gratitude. A framed drawing of the two men and a poem she had written titled, Heroes Among Us. Her voice trembled with emotion as she read aloud. You taught us that respect isn't loud. It's quiet, like a salute. You showed us that courage isn't always big. It's sometimes kneeling down. The audience erupted into applause, wiping away tears as the girl hugged Harold and shook James's hand. That night, as Harold sat in his living room flipping through old photographs, he felt a deep sense of peace. For so many years, he had carried the weight of his memories alone. Now, thanks to James and the ripple effect of their shared moment, he knew he wasn't carrying it anymore. It was being held by everyone who had been inspired by their story. James, too, felt a renewed sense of pride in his role, knowing that he had helped create something lasting and meaningful. Their story became a reminder that human connection doesn't require grand gestures or elaborate speeches. Sometimes it's as simple as a salute, a kneel, or a heartfelt thank you. And though Harold and James came from different worlds, their brief encounter proved that respect knows no boundaries. It bridges gaps, heals wounds, and reminds us of our shared humanity. In doing so, it left behind a legacy that would endure for generations to come.